you, and thank you so much for joining us on a weekend. On behalf of iGen Plus, I would like to welcome you all in our webinar session today. iGen Plus is a cultural and creative school for teenagers that aims to inculcate life skills in young students with the pretext of the ancient wisdom and knowledge that we have. We conduct various courses, competitions, events, and experiences with the same aim. Since the lockdown started, we've been conducting multiple webinar sessions on the weekends to initiate some interesting conversations from entrepreneurship to leadership lessons from Ramayana, mindfulness on writing, debating, ancient Indian geometry, etc. Today, we have a very interesting session titled The Life Cycle of the Sun, as most of you would already be aware. So if you are a space science enthusiast and if the sun, stars, planets in our galaxy and beyond fascinate you, or even if you're just a curious learner, then this session will be exciting for you because this session will explore the wonder of space science combined with the wisdom of Puranas. During the session, we will discover the story of how the sun came into being and what is the life cycle of this gigantic ball of hot masses as stated in our Puranas and discovered by modern science. And to take us through that journey, we have with us Mr. Ganesh Swaminathan. Ganesh sir, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Ganesh sir is an engineer by profession from IIT Delhi. After completing his MBA from IIM Ahmedabad, he spent most of his professional life in a multinational organization in the field of technology. But he has had a deep interest in space science ever since he was in school. So about 8 years ago, he developed an interest in the Puranas. And he was fascinated by the insights that the ancient texts offered, particularly the parallels to space science. He has researched most of the Mahapuranas besides other texts in preparation for writing his book titled From the Beginning of Time. The Puranas, as their name suggests, describe events deep in the Earth's past. Finding a complete cosmology in the ancient Puranic texts that are mostly aligned to the view of science is almost incredible. Ganesh sir's book delves into many stories along with external evidence to come up with a compelling chronicle of our universe. The book shows the Puranic texts in a fascinating new light and also serves as a primer to the general interest reader by tackling some of the questions that modern science is grappling with in its study of the cosmos. I've had a chance to speak with Ganesh ji on multiple occasions, and it was so exciting to find someone equally in awe of the space science as much as I was. And conversations with him have always been as interesting as informative. So I am really excited and looking forward to the session. Thank you so much again, Ganesh sir, for joining us. I will hand it over to you from here. And I would request all our participants to feel free to share their thoughts in the chat box during the session. Ganesh sir will be taking us through a presentation and then we'll open to questions and answers. So feel free to ask your questions by unmuting yourself or putting in the chat. Ganesh sir, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you very much, Ayushi. Are you hearing me well?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thanks to all the people who made the time today for this session. I hope you find it interesting. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So the title of this talk is The Puranas and the Life Cycle of the Sun. So the Puranas, I mean, these are two completely different concepts. The Puranas are very old and the life cycle of the sun is extremely new. But I'm hoping that I can give you a sense of wonder that I had when I discovered this linkage at the end of this presentation, right? So what I'll have is I'll have a very brief introduction to the presentation and a little bit to the sun. The sun has 5 stages in its life cycle. And so in the first segment, we'll talk about the first 3 stages, which is the birth, the youth, and up to the current stage, right? And then the next segment, we'll have the final 2 stages of the life cycle of the sun. There's a very brief summary. And I think my presentation should take about 35 minutes. And that should leave about 15-20 minutes for any questions or comments you might have at the end. I'll do my best to answer them, and if I don't have answers, I'll make sure I put them down and go and look for answers as best as I can. Okay, let's get started. So first thing is this presentation quotes from English translations of the Puranas. The Puranas, the translations are by a board of scholars. And the Board of Scholars was sponsored, the translation was sponsored by the government of India in the 1950s. So it's about 70 years ago, 60 to 70 years ago now. But the government of India set up an expert group to go and translate the Puranas because they are such a treasure for India. And but they are old now, right? But the verses that I will quote today for this presentation are from the Brahmanda Purana, the Markandeya Purana, and the Varaha Purana, right? So the book itself has had quotes from about 15 different more than 12 different Puranas. But for today's segment, I'll be just quoting from about 3. As Ayushi mentioned, the word Purana in Sanskrit means ancient, but it's hard to believe that they can offer a complete cosmology. And so I found it very hard. And so when I discovered it, I had to write a book essentially to convince both myself and people like us, people who are interested both in the science and in our heritage, that the two are not necessarily different from each other, right? And so because it combines the science and the Puranas, both the Puranas and the science are quoted. And always the science is quoted up front, because what it does is science offers the framework to help us understand the verses in the Puranas. Okay, so let's start with a very basic idea of the science of the sun. So the sun is one of the billions of what are referred to as low mass stars in the Milky Way, and more than 90% of the stars in the Milky Way are considered low mass stars. And over 90% of the sun is hydrogen, and most of the rest is helium. And it is the host star for our solar system. It is the source of all the energy. So if you look at the entire solar system, the only thing that produces the energy in significant quantity is the sun. And practically everything in the solar system originates from our sun. Practically everything does, because, and we'll see that in a little while. The planets form from the planetary dust of the sun, and so on, right? So everything originates from the sun itself. A very brief look at the internal structure of the sun. The sun is first thing, we don't understand the sun very well, and so NASA is still sending probes to the sun. Currently, there's a probe that is on its way to the sun, and it's probably gotten the closest that anybody has ever gotten to the sun, and it's called the NASA Parker probe. But I think there's some basic understanding, and we don't need a lot of detail for our session here. So we'll look at the sun as having two levels, basically, right? There's a core where fusion occurs, and fusion is the source of energy for the sun, nuclear fusion. And this is a zone of very high temperature and pressure. So a temperature of up to 10 million degrees Kelvin, right? And very, very high pressure. And at this high temperature and pressure, hydrogen atoms are fused together to form helium, and the fusion process releases an enormous amount of energy, right? This is the energy that you see in a hydrogen bomb or in the fusion process, right? And then we have outside the core, we have the shell. And in the shell, the energy is transferred outwards. And the energy is transferred outwards primarily through convection and radiation. So you can see in the adjoining picture, you can see a core, you can see a radiation zone right next to it, and then you can see a convection zone just outside of it. And there are further layers outside. There's a photosphere and a chromosphere and a corona. And the photosphere and the chromosphere are the ones that we can see, right? When we look at the sun during an eclipse or something, those are the things that we see. But here we are looking at, we're just looking at the internal structure of the sun, okay? Let's see what the Puranas have to say about it, right? So as we say, all the energy within the solar system originates from the sun. Therefore, if you do any act of creation requires energy, right? To transform any material, you require energy, and therefore anything that's even created conceptually is created by the sun, right? Because unless you have the creative energy of the sun, no creation can take place. And so you have the following verse in the Brahmanda Purana. It says, the entire universe, including the devas, asuras, and the human beings, originate from the sun. It is from him that everything is born and everything gets merged into him alone. And this is from the Brahmanda Purana, book 1, section 2, and chapter 24. So all the verses that will be quoted, they'll not only mention the Purana, they'll mention the book, the section, and the chapter, and the verse. So in case any of you is interested in finding out some more, you can go to the specific verse and you can see for yourself, and you can read the verses before and after that to get an idea of the context. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to point out. And the second thing I want to point out is I've underlined the thing. So we all understand the fact that everything originates from the sun. What is less obvious to us is the phrase, and everything gets merged into him alone. So I want to call your attention to it, and we'll come back to it at the end of our presentation. Yep. So the life cycle of the sun, as far as modern science is concerned, has 5 stages. It has a stage of birth of the young star, the mature star, which is the current stage today. And this mature stage will last for another 3 to 5 billion years. So you'll see some pretty dramatic information about the sun. So you don't need to worry about that. We are safe for the next 3 to 5 billion years. So anything that will happen, any change that will happen beyond that. We then have the stage called the red giant stage. And following that, we have the white dwarf stage. And after that, the sun actually dies, right? Like every star has a life cycle of between 8 to 10 billion years. And a low mass star, that is, and the star dies after that, right? It may sound incredible, but the Puranas have a description for each of the 5 stages of the sun. And this is what that I found very amazing. I mean, I had to do a lot of research to kind of uncover this, but I'll share this with you, and you can share your thoughts with me at the end of the presentation. So the first 2 are described through stories as allegory. So meaning they represent natural phenomenon as a part of a story. The birth, the young star, and the transition to the mature star is through stories. The mature stage is obviously observed today, right? And so it is a downright description. But what is really fascinating is the description of the red giant and the white dwarf, which are also in description form. And I find that really fascinating that you can do something like that. The first story of the birth is a very brief story. The second story of the young star and the transition to the mature stage is a little more complex story. And like I said, the description of the red giant and the white dwarf is amazingly detailed. Okay. So then we go to the life cycle of the sun, the first 3 stages. So let me pause for a minute here and check. Are you hearing me well? Am I speaking too fast, too slow? Is everything okay? Aishif, can you give me, what do you think?
I think we are good. We are able to hear you clearly, and I think we are going good.
Everything's okay?
Anyone else wants to add something? Do you want it to go slow, or is it okay?
Okay, maybe we can go.
We can continue, sir.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you well. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Yeah. So we'll talk about the first 3 stages: the birth, the young star, and the mature, the current stage. Yeah. So the birth of a star has what is called the nebular hypothesis, right? It's the most widely accepted model of star formation. And according to the hypothesis, stars are formed in giant clouds of hydrogen. They are called giant molecular clouds. And they are named after the constellation they are located in. So if you look at the image on the screen, it's actually the Orion molecular cloud. It's a giant molecular cloud which is found in the constellation Orion. And you can see the 3 stars of the belt of Orion here, which identifies the constellation, right? These giant molecular clouds can stay unchanged for long periods of time. So they are in some kind of dynamic, unstable equilibrium, right? But some perturbation can initiate star formation. And a perturbation in this case could be a supernova in the vicinity, or a couple of giant stars which have a big gravitational impact on the place. And they can initiate star formation. And what happens is that at the very early stage, it forms a ball of gas. So just imagine a huge cloud of gas at one place. The gas starts to collapse on it itself. So it forms a ball of gas in that local region, right? And the ball starts to collapse due to its own gravity, right? And so there's no other external force. There's just a perturbation from some external action. But beyond that, the gas just starts to collapse in on itself. And at this stage, it emits neither heat nor light, right? It's just a ball of gas that is collapsing on itself due to gravity. Let's see what the Puranas say about it. There's a story in the Puranas called the birth of Martanda. And the Puranas talks about the fetus leading to the formation of the sun. So in the Puranas, the sun is seen as born from sage Kasyapa and Aditi, right? And so the verse in the Brahmanda Purana says, in the beginning, the Holy Lord created an egg within her belly. The powerful fetus was within the egg, and the fetus leads to the formation of the sun, right? So it's said this. And then it says, when it was taken out of the belly, it resembled a dead lump. Since he was born dead, Mrita, as an egg under, the sun is called Martanda by the learned men, right? So the fetus, Martanda, was inert. It did not produce any heat or light. It is still a fetus. It's not fully developed. And that's called Martanda. And this is how modern science actually says. Right? It's very well aligned with modern science. Okay, but this is just a handful of verses. So let's move forward to the next stage. The second stage is the stage of a young star, right? And this giant ball of gas continues to collapse, right? Again, it's driven by its own gravity. And because of the gravitational pressure, heat starts to build up in this ball of gas. And then it starts to first emit heat, and then over a period of time, light. And it's called a young stellar object. And it still has a dust of gas, and it still has a disk of gas and dust around it, right? Remember, it was originated from a disk of gas, right? Originally, the giant molecular cloud. And over time, the young star becomes extremely active, right? What happens is that this young star is still a large ball of gas. It's very bright. It's very active. And its activity is in the form of giant X-ray emissions. Huge amounts of X-rays is emitted by this ball of gas. And like the sun has, many of you may be familiar, it has solar flares. This ball of gas also emits flares, but the flares are can be up to 1,000 times larger than what our sun emits. So it's very active, extremely active, right? And because the flaring is so huge, it makes the star look misshapen. So instead of being circular, because there's something sticking out as a giant flare, it looks, it doesn't look very circular, basically. And these stars are called T Tauri stars, and they were discovered by a Japanese astrophysicist, and they were first discovered in the constellation Taurus. So the first prototype star of this was discovered in the constellation Taurus, and so it was named after the constellation Taurus. So the transition to the current mature sun, the star continues to collapse, again driven by gravitation, and the temperature and the pressure continues to increase, especially so in the core, where you have the maximum temperature and the maximum pressure. And because you have hydrogen atoms in the core at very high temperature and pressure, you have nuclear fusion that is initiated in the core. And so what happens is that the hydrogen atoms in the core, because of the very high temperature and pressure, start to fuse. And the nuclear fusion, they form helium and they start producing energy. And this energy, they produce an enormous amount of energy in the form of heat and light. And what happens is the sun now stops collapsing, and it's in a form of dynamic stability, right? And so what happens is that you have the gravitational pressure that is driving the star to collapse, and the heat basically is forcing it to expand. And so you have the two of them at some point in a perfect balance. And so you have this giant ball of gas, which is emitting a lot of height, which is almost perfectly spherical. Now, it's kind of difficult to imagine how perfectly spherical it is, but you can see it in the image. And so the current sun it's smaller, it's less active, and it's less brighter than what it was in the T Tauri stage of its life. Okay. Let's look at what the Puranas have to say about it. The Puranas have a story called the marriage of Samjana and Vivaswan. The sun god Vivaswan marries Visvakarman's daughter Samjana. And Visvakarman is the creator of all the immobile beings in the Puranas, right? That's how he's described. And the Purana says, originally the form of Vivaswan was so refulgent that the rays spread sidewards, upwards, and downwards. The gentle lady Samjana was afflicted by the sun, right? So they described that this Vivaswan, the young Vivaswan, was extremely active, and it had rays, which is the flares going out in all directions. And it was so bright that his wife Samjana was very unhappy, afflicted, right? And she could, in another verse it says, she could not look at him in the face. So she had to avert her gaze and look down. And she became very unhappy. She said, I am married to this sun, but I cannot stay close to him and I cannot look at the sun. So what is the point of such a marriage, right? And so Samjana decides to return to her father's house. She's very unhappy, but she leaves behind in her place. This is the story. This is the story in the Purana. She leaves behind an entity called Chaya, which is just a copy of herself in her place. And she goes to her father's house. And her father says, father welcomes her. But after a period of time, he says, I'm unable to help you. You're married now and you need to, figure out how you need to manage this with your husband. And so she doesn't know what to do. And so she goes off to pray. She performs a penance. So the son immediately doesn't know that his wife is left. But after a while, because of some turn of events, he finds out that Chaya is not his real wife. And he gets upset and he goes to her house, to Samjana's house, to her father's house to look for her. And Visvakarman says that she had come here, but she had since left. It's been a while. And she gently suggests to the sun, maybe you want to reduce your brightness and your size so that there is happiness in your life, right? And then he lets it be because he's the father-in-law and he's advising another person. So he leaves it go at that. And then, so the son still doesn't know where his wife is. So he goes into meditation and then he discovers that his wife is praying. And she's praying for him to be less bright and easier to live with. And then he realizes that what he needs to do. So he asks his father-in-law, Visvakarman, and he says, pare down my splendor now, quoth the sun. And Visvakarman pared down the splendor of the sun and obtains the praises of the gods, right? So this verse is from the Markandeya Purana. And Visvakarman proceeds to reduce the brightness of the sun. And the Brahmanda Purana says he pruned the irregular parts of his brilliance where his refulgence was taken away. The sun had his brilliance uprooted or reduced, right? Again, this quote is from verses from the Brahmanda Purana. And In the process of pruning, Vishwakarman kept intact in spherical shape, the 16th part of the Lord of Heaven. And the sun's body was exceedingly beautiful and charming then. So if you reduce the size of a sphere to 1/16th, that the radius reduces by to about 40%. The radius reduces by 60%. So the Purana is suggesting that the size of the sun, the radius of the sun got reduced by about 60%, and all the parts that were flared were removed. So if you look at it, in the process, the sun is reduced in size, it is reduced in brilliance, and it looks smooth and spherical. And these are precisely the changes that are suggested by modern science as the sun transitions from a T Tauri star to the current mature stage. So an amazing coincidence between what the Puranas suggest in a very simple story. So remember, you can read the story as a wonderful story. It's a very beautiful story. It has been retold many times. You can see people telling the story on YouTube, but it has never been looked at in the context of the life cycle of the sun. Okay, let's go on. So here's an interesting part. So there is a passage in the Varaha Purana describing this event, and so the Devas. So when the sun is very active, the Devas pray to the god, to sun, and they say, "Be pleased at our prayer and protect us all, O God," because the sun was so active that even the Devas could not bear his heat. And then the verse says, "When extolled by the Devas, the sun assumed a gentle form. The fierceness became reduced for the Devas. It was in the Tithi Saptami that the sun became embodied." This is from the Varaha Purana. And the verse implies that the sun became gentle and his fierceness was reduced. And it is on the Tithi Saptami that the sun became embodied. So the sun that we see today was born on the Tithi Saptami, was born because of this transition, right? And and the Varaha Purana says it was in the Tithi Saptami. The Skanda Purana, I haven't quoted the verse here. Actually, it's more specific, and it says it is in the Magha Shukla Saptami, in the month of Magha, January, February. And in the south, this day is called Radha Saptami. It is a very special day in the south of India. In the north of India, it's called Surya Jayanti, the birthday of the sun. So it's amazing, you have a festival that you may not understand the science of the sun, but you have a festival that celebrates it, and you have an entire science that speaks to it, that is described in the Puranas. And if you don't understand the science, you can just look at the story and celebrate the event. So it's a very beautiful correlation between a festival that we can experience in our daily lives, the science that a scholar can understand, and a story that lay people can understand. So this thing kind of pulls all these three things together. So I thought it was quite fascinating. There's a lot of descriptions about the sun. Actually, the Markandeya Purana is what is called a Saura Purana, which means that it's a Purana that describes the sun in great detail. The Brahmanda Purana has very brief, crisp descriptions, and that's why I'm quoting a lot from it, because otherwise the Markandeya Puranas are much more extensive in their description. So the Puranas also describe the distance of the sun, and actually within about, I think, 15 to 20% of the actual distance that we measure today. What is interesting is that it also mentions the water cycle. Now, a lot of ancient texts talk about the fact that the rivers keep flowing into the sea, but the sea never overflows, right? But they never talk about a water cycle. The water cycle was first proposed by a French engineer by the name of Bernard Palissy in the late 16th century. And modern science didn't accept it until the early 19th century, right? So people didn't take him seriously, or didn't get into into broad acceptance until early 19th century. Let's see what the Puranas have to say about it. So again, the Brahmanda Purana has this passage. In combination with the wind, the rays of the sun carry the waters from the ocean, and that water becomes the nectar-like life giver unto the plants. The the water is stationed in the water station in the clouds falls down, accompanied by wind. They spread everywhere for the welfare of all living beings. So it talks about the water, it talks about the formation of clouds, and it talks about the falling down of rain, right? Not new. There is also a verse that I have not quoted here, which talks specifically about smoke, which is basically dust, which is essential for formation of the cloud. So many of you may have been taught in school that cloud formation requires condensation of all the water vapor in the atmosphere around particles of dust in the atmosphere, in the higher levels of the atmosphere, right? So it talks about the necessity of particles of dust to form clouds. And it also talks about the cyclical nature of the process, where it says the water is continuously thrown up, turned into vapor, and dropped down. Again, this is a quote from the Brahmanda Purana. So amazing amount of detail for something that was discovered fairly recently, and something unlike the life cycle of the sun that we are not very familiar with. Most of us understand the water cycle and can appreciate this quite well. Okay. And this was all more than 1,000 years before it was articulated by Palissy, right? So, so the Puranas are dated to somewhere about 2,000 years ago, without getting too specific. And to have a text 2,000 years ago speak about this in such detail, I find quite amazing, frankly. Okay. So we've covered the first 3 stages, and we now go to the final 2 stages of the sun. So we have the red giant and the white dwarf. And so in the red giant stage, what happens is that the hydrogen in the core gets exhausted, right? And so what happens is all the hydrogen gets converted to helium in about, as I said, in about 3 to 5 billion years. All the atoms of hydrogen fuse and form helium, right? And now when that happens, the sun can produce energy in 2 ways. So the first thing it can do is that the helium atoms can combine to form carbon, right? So hydrogen has an atomic number of 1, and 2 hydrogen atoms combining to form helium has an atomic number of 2. Helium has an atomic number of 2, and 2 helium atoms form an atom of carbon, which has an atomic number of 4, right? So that's the first thing that can happen. Again, that's a form of nuclear fusion that releases a lot of energy. And besides that, the hydrogen in the shell can now fuse to form helium, right? So you have a lot of energy that gets released, and the sun grows enormously in size at this stage. And and so it becomes a giant sun, which is why it's called a red giant. And an example of a red giant is in the nakshatra system is the star Rohini. In modern science, this star is called Aldebaran. What happens, and Aldebaran is, or Rohini is a red giant star, right? And it's one of the brightest stars in the night sky, one of the brightest stars in the night sky. And what happens is that Mercury and the sun becomes so big that Mercury and Venus get absorbed into the sun. The globe of the sun covers Mercury and Venus. So if you look at the image on the right-hand side, you can see the sun is now much bigger, and you can see right next to it is the Earth, right? And you have Mars, and Earth has, this is an artist impression. So I've got this from the web, from a site called phys.org. And what are considered cold planets today, right? Jupiter and Saturn get into the habitable zone because the sun's heat can, transforms them into a more habitable place, right? That's not very clear yet. So that's the first thing that happens. And what happens is that and scientists have been able to model this. And it's a very complex model that I won't go into at this stage. And I'll be honest, I'm not an astrophysicist, so I can't understand it completely. But in any case, I don't want to go into the detail. But as the red giant grows in size, the surface of the sun gets very close to the Earth. So you can see the surface of the sun here, and the Earth. This is again an artist impression, and the Earth is very close by, and the Earth is literally burnt by the sun's heat and the solar flares. So imagine solar flares coming out from the sun. They will completely envelop the Earth and go, millions of kilometers out into space. And so what happens is that the Earth is extremely hot, and there is probably lava on the surface of as the crust of the Earth. The Earth has a crust to it, and the crust of the Earth cracks, and the hot mantle that's below breaks through the crust, and it shows up as lava on the surface, or the rocks can become extremely hot and glowing. And so it's a very extremely hot planet, basically, right? So let's see what the Puranas have to say about it. Just like the modern science is a name for this called the red giant, the Puranas too have a specific term for the sun in this stage. The Puranas term the sun as the Samvartaka Aditya. Samvartaka is destruction and Aditya is sun. It is the sun that destroys the world. So it basically completely destroys the earth, right? So the verse says when the end of the Kalpa arrives, the sun of 7 rays assumes the form of Samvartaka Aditya, the sun of final annihilation, and burns down the 3 worlds. Again, this is from the Brahmanda Purana. Right? Let's keep going. So this is not just one verse now. Amazingly, the Brahmanda Purana has about 25 verses that describes the sun. 25 verses, right? And it's an amazing amount of detail. And I don't want to quote all the 25 verses, but I want to give you a sample of some of the verses so you get an idea of the level of detail that's available in this in the Puranas. So it starts out with an extensive drought on the planet, right? So when the sun, before it becomes a red giant sun, the sun is still growing in size and getting close to the earth. And as it gets close to the earth, what happens is that the Earth planet starts to get hot, and when it gets hot, there is a drought, right? There is no rain, and there's drought on the planet. And the Purana says there is a continued drought lasting for 100 years that takes place. Living beings deficient in strength become dissolved and get mingled with the dust. So basically it says there is no water on the surface of the earth, very little water. And if a plant or an animal or an insect requires water, then it'll die, and its body will turn into dust, basically, right? Into ash and into dust. So it's very simple. Then it says that the water in the rivers and the oceans turn into vapor. It says the 7 rays of the sun that blaze in the sky, sucking up water, drink water from the great ocean. Being burnt by their brilliant flames, the earth, including mountains, rivers, and oceans, become bereft of moisture and vicinity. So not only does the ocean dry out completely, the water in the ocean boils off into the atmosphere. The moisture that's available on the earth, in the ground, in the rocks, and so on, evaporates and goes into the sky. And the mountains collapse due to the sun's heat. So the volcanoes explode, the mountains explode, and they collapse, and they fill up the ocean basins get filled up with all the lava and so on. And it says everything mobile and immobile gets dissolved, and the earth, devoid of trees and even grass, may seem like the back of a tortoise. So it becomes smooth, and unlike having a lot of high mountain ranges and deep ocean basins, it just becomes very smooth because everything is just collapsed. And then it says, finally, the earth is described as literally glowing from the sun's heat. And says, getting the splendor transmitted to it, the entire universe slowly assumes the form of a huge block of iron and shines thus. So if you leave a block of iron in fire, like many of you will know, after a period of time, it just begins to glow. And so the Puranas say that the earth just begins to glow after a period of time, after being in the vicinity of the sun. And this is just like we saw in this artist impression, right? The earth is very close to the sun, and it's literally glowing from the heat. So amazing. And again, this is just as suggested by modern science, and the amazing level of detail that not just the description, but the sequence of events that has been described in the Brahmanda Purana is amazing. Nothing short of amazing, actually. Then we go to the white dwarf stage, right? The death of a star, and sun continues the core continues to undergo fusion, right? And finally, the carbon runs out, right? So the helium runs out, it all forms carbon, and then the carbon, which has an atomic number of 4, starts to fuse and forms oxygen, right? which is the next, has an atomic number of 8. And so the fusion keeps on going. And then finally, it gets to such a large extent that the atoms can no longer fuse, because it just the atoms are so large that it's not possible to fuse them anymore. And what happens when the fusion stops? There is no energy, no heat generated in the heart of the sun, in the core of the sun. And that's a problem, right? Because the sun was in dynamic equilibrium, where the gravitational force from the outside and the heat from the outside were in dynamic equilibrium. And when the core stops producing energy, this core begins to collapse. It just collapses in on itself. And it becomes very small and very dense, right? And the material in the shell gets thrown out into space. And it produces very beautiful planetary nebulae. So many of you are interested in astronomy, if you go into any site on astronomy or read a book on astronomy, you'll find beautiful pictures of planetary nebulae, which is basically the gas in the shell gets thrown out and starts to glow because of the radiation from the core, right? And it produces these beautiful images. The white dwarf star is incredibly compact, right? So it's half the mass of the sun and it's the size of the Earth. So this is a photograph by NASA about what they think is a white dwarf star and a Jupiter-sized planet in the background. So you can see the sun is actually, the sun is normally 1,000 times larger than Jupiter. And here it is actually smaller than Jupiter because it has collapsed into a very small size. But more importantly, what happens is that the surface of the sun, which was very close to the Earth as a red giant, now the surface of the sun is millions of kilometers away, right? And because the sun has collapsed in size. Moreover, it's not producing energy, right? So, and so what happens is the planet starts to cool. And when the planet starts to cool rapidly, because the process of collapse is quite rapid, the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, it starts to condense, and it forms huge clouds. And you have to get an idea of the size of the clouds. It's not what we think of as huge clouds, right? You have to imagine the entire amount of water in the oceans, in the rivers, in the polar ice caps, in the snow caps of the mountain, in the glaciers, in the underwater aquifers. Everything is now in the atmosphere, right? It's the water from the bodies of plants, of animals, of grass, of insects, and in the rocks and in the earth, in the mud. Everything that has water has now gone into the atmosphere. And now this entire mass of water is now going to condense and form clouds. So you can imagine how big these clouds are going to be. So the Brahmanda Purana says some of these clouds are the size of an excellent city. Some can be compared to herds of elephants. Some clouds shine like huge mountains, right? And then they have rain, and the cloud shower, torrential rain, and then the cloud shower rain in huge torrents. They destroy the whole of the extremely terrific and inauspicious fire. So remember, the sun may have collapsed, but the earth is still extremely hot because of all the lava and the mantle on the surface. And so the first thing that happens is when the water falls on the surface, it first has to put out the fire. When it puts out the fire, it evaporates again and forms clouds. And then this cycle happens, and it cools the earth first, and then it starts to fill up the planet. And the entire planet, it says, the universe becomes filled with the water. And the whole of the earth gets submerged in the Ekarnava. The word Ekarnava means Eka is one, and Ardava means ocean. So it's the one great ocean. So imagine the earth being covered by a single great ocean. And it says a vast expanse of the ground, including mountains, continents, and intervening spaces, being as if swallowed up, stands submerged in water, right? And this marks the end of the Kalpa, right? When everything mobile and immobile becomes dissolved, destroyed in this single, terrible, vast expanse of water. 1,000 Chaturyugas are completed, and it is said that the Kalpa has come to a close. So the Brahmanda Purana says this pralaya, right? This giant flood that covers the earth, is the pralaya in the end of a kalpa, and it marks the end of a kalpa. And we can see how well it maps to the life cycle of the sun here. Okay. So I just want to summarize, take a couple of minutes to summarize. I think I'm a little over time. I hope you have a couple of minutes for me, Ayushi. Let me summarize very quickly. So we know from the science of the sun, right? We know that it has 5 stages. We know it has the stage of birth, the young star, the mature star, the red giant star, and the white dwarf, after which it dies. And in the Puranas, we saw for the birth, we saw the birth of Martanda, the inert star that emits neither heat nor light. We saw for the young star, we saw the marriage of Samjana and Vivaswan, where the brightness of Vivaswan was extremely high. It had rays coming out in all directions, and we saw the transition to the mature sun. We saw the Surya Jayanti. We saw the rays and the size and the brightness being reduced, and we saw the water cycle description of the mature sun. We saw the red giant as the Samvartaka Aditya, and the sun's heat hitting up the earth and making it glow. And we saw the white dwarf, the Samvartaka clouds, which rain water and submerge the earth in the great pralaya, right? And it's an astonishing level of correlation between the life cycle of the sun and the 5 stories. So the first 3 are stories. So these 2 are stories, and the transition to this is a story. But you can see these 2 are descriptions, and if you put all of these together, you will see that the correlation is just amazing. And you can read these as just stories. These are beautiful stories. They are pearls of literature. So you can just read them as lovely literature, as beautiful stories. But if you have an interest in space science, like I did accidentally, I did not go to look for this. I found the correlation to be absolutely fascinating. So just to close, the material comes from a book of mine called From the Beginning of Time. It describes the sun. It describes the Puranic universe. It describes the entire universe. It describes the sun, which I described earlier along with the Pralaya. There's a beautiful section on the Great Flood, which goes into great detail. It talks about the earth, its shape, size, geography, events in the earth's history, such as the descent of the Ganga. The descent of the Ganga is a very scientific description, actually. I don't have the time to go into it here, but it's quite amazing. The book talks about the Brahmanda, which is composed of the Bhumandala and the Devaloka and the Patalaloka. And one of the most complex and fascinating stories is the story of the moon. The origin of the moon, the disappearance of the moon, and its reappearance in the churning of the Kshirodasagara. Right? So I wanted to share that in the book and make it available. And I wanted to share the story of the sun in this short session that was given to me. So thank you very much for your time. Ayushi ji, I apologize. I think I'm over time by about 5 minutes or so. Apologies for that. But at this stage, I'm happy to take any questions or comments. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.